Hello and welcome to this session on Action for Better Trade, organized by the World Economic Forum as part of the Trade and Sustainability Hub. My name is Aditi Verghese, and I'm a policy lead for international trade and investment at the World Economic Forum. I think despite the disappointment we've all felt with the WTO Ministerial Conference having to be postponed, we've seen the Secretariat and the members really step up to keep the momentum going and on various initiatives. And as we speak, there's a press conference being held to announce the adoption of a declaration on services domestic regulation. And we're also hoping for various trade and environment initiatives to be launched as well. So in this session, we want to acknowledge the progress that's being made through the WTO while linking it to action and reforms on the ground that actually benefit people and the planet. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel who will share their experiences of making trade work better in practice. So through trade facilitation and investment facilitation, but also for sustainability and improved labor conditions. So I'm pleased to introduce Sabine Dall'Omo, who is the CEO of Siemens Southern and Eastern Africa, Erik Churchill, Vice President of Public Affairs at UPS, and Rick Samans, Director of Research at the International Labour Organization. In addition, we have brief recorded remarks from the Vice Minister of Integration and Foreign Trade of Guatemala, Edith Flores de Molina, who unfortunately couldn't be with us live. Before I turn to the panel, please take a second to answer the question on your screen to help us set the stage for this conversation. So the question is, what are the main obstacles to making trade work for people and the environment? Is it a lack of adequate rules, resources, coordination, data and analytics, political will, or private sector engagement? And we recognize this is a broad question, but it'll be interesting to see essentially what these aspects are and which of these aspects get picked up by our speakers. Also, please, if you have any questions, do put them in the chat and we'll get to them in the Q&A. We've had a little bit of time to answer that. Perhaps we can take a look at the results of the poll. Okay, so we have political will, coordination, adequate rules around the same, followed by resources, private sector engagement, and finally data and analysis. That's an interesting result. I think what's interesting is, even though adequate rules seems quite important, it's not at the top of the list, which probably means there's a lot we can do even where negotiation progress is slow. So thanks for that. We'll now move on to our panelists, starting with Sabine. So Sabine, thanks so much for joining us. We were expecting a statement on investment facilitation at NC12 and possibly calling for a final agreement to be negotiated by the end of 2022. How important is investment facilitation for businesses like yours, and what are the practical challenges that it can help solve?
Thanks, first of all, for having me today on the panel. And I think it's an absolute valuable content which we are discussing today, because obviously we do want to have more investment, specifically also in developing economies, right? When I look at the global trade, we do see that the majority of goods are traded are still semi-finished products or raw material. And there we see that there is no equal balance at this point in time between economies of developed nations and currently developing nations with regards to the share they're having in industrial trade. For a company like Siemens, if we look specifically now, and I'm talking for the African continent and the region I'm responsible for us, trade facilitation is incredibly important, because if you look at many countries themselves don't have the necessary credit standing, so that, you know, if we want to proceed with a contract, we have sufficient coverage for political risk, but also for other risks, be it through insurance companies, but also finding bankable solutions and bankable activities in these countries. So where you also see then later on that there is a repayment of the investment done and your investment is not lost. So hence like trade facilitation specifically between the developed nations, and I always like to take one into consideration, which clearly made a huge difference also to Siemens, is the compact with Africa, which was an initiative by the German government at the time on the sidelines of the G20 program in 2017, which incorporated a number of African countries like Egypt, like Ghana, Rwanda, where you see, but also Ivory Coast, for instance, where you see significant development after this kind of engagement has happened. And the barriers for doing business have been taken away, because often what you see is that developing countries, because they're not as integrated into the value chain, do not really know what companies need as a safety net in order to invest in their countries. And it's not just tax incentives you give. You know, you want, as a company, you want to have a clear legal framework. You would like to have a rule of law, and you do want to know that the trust in the government is there. What means also that taxes, but also compliance-related aspects are taken serious, and the government will try their utmost best to make that kind of setting for a company like us palatable. And if I look particular in bigger projects, which we did in some of the countries, and you will know some of our projects which we recently executed, and currently we have, for instance, in Egypt, the mobility extension with regards to the link between the new capital and Cairo. This would not be possible if there would no facilitation for such deal happening. And why is it so important? Because with companies like us going into countries and establishing an infrastructure project or any other investment like a production, that means with that there will be also small, medium enterprises of international nature, but also a lot of development from the local source coming into the economy, and hence it creates a significant amount of jobs by us being active. And therefore, for us, really, really important.
Excellent, thank you. Lots of really practical issues and also solutions there. Moving a little bit more to environment now with Erik, we were hoping to see trade and environment initiatives launched soon, but we just wanted to check with you, where do you see room for more concrete action from the private sector on trade and environmental sustainability?
Thanks, Aditi. It's great to be here with you and everyone. I think that what we see coming out of COP is that there have been a lot of really big, important commitments from the private sector on environmental sustainability. And I don't think that we should dismiss those in any way. Those are really substantial. For a company like UPS, we committed to reduce the carbon intensity by 50% for every package that we deliver by 2035. That's big. That's a big step forward, and we've seen that from across sectors, those kinds of commitments from multinationals. But I think what we shouldn't forget, and this is where it gets to trade, is those commitments need to go down the supply chain. So what it takes for UPS as a next step, not only do we have to think about our own emissions, but we need to work with our customers. So those are these small businesses all over the world that are shipping with UPS and have less means than a major multinational and perhaps less know-how on how to improve their logistics, improve their packaging, find new, get new market access for sustainable products. And I think making sure that that gets down to the small business level is really essential. That's what will change this from something that's just happening in advanced industrialized countries and major multinationals to something that's globally significant and is mainstream throughout society. So I think that is what we would like to see. I think that there are a number of initiatives that the WTO is considering that could advance that. But you hear it from developing countries that there are a lot of concerns. There are concerns over fossil fuel subsidies. There are concerns over fisheries. So making sure that we understand what is the impact on small businesses at every stage when we consider those agreements. That's what's important to reach that kind of consensus at the multilateral level.
Perfect, thank you. And again, when you talk about supply chains, it's also quite relevant to talk about labor. Moving to Rick, to you for the next question. How could trade policy and practice help raise labor standards and increase wages and ensure human and worker rights and diversity?
Thanks, Aditi, and good afternoon, or whatever time of day it happens to be for you, wherever you're watching from. This question you're posing to me is quite relevant to the results of the poll that was just held, I think. I think, Aditi, you observed that the rules choice in the poll did not come out on top, and which suggested that there are other ways to move the ball forward, so to speak, on a number of these issues beyond negotiated disciplines in trade agreements, and particularly multilateral trade agreements. So let me pick up on that, because that's a particularly apposite observation in this area. The labor and sort of broadly speaking, in social inclusion aspects of trade. I would suggest to everyone here that the best way that trade policy can contribute to a wider degree of social inclusion in economic integration is in getting beyond, taking its sights and looking beyond the boundaries of trade policy. And instead of viewing trade agreements as principally an end in itself, rather viewing it as something that needs to be coupled systematically and in a very structured way with a strategy to strengthen investment in people. And this has been a systemic failing, I would argue, of trade policy as it's been practiced to a large extent, to the most extent, for the last several decades. In that trade negotiations, whether they be at the multilateral level or in regional trade agreements, have tended to be exercises that have been conducted between and among trade ministries, which really had to do with the rules, with the rules for cross-border exchanges of commerce and capital, and to some extent, people. But they have suffered, I think, certainly economically, but I think more recently it's been very visible that they've suffered politically by not being paired with a very strong degree of investment in people in a few key dimensions. Let me tell you what I mean by that. First, in the employment-intensive areas of the economy, through strengthened skills, capacity, worker transitions, and the like, so that people can adapt to the transitions in the workforce that trade agreements, trade liberalization contribute to in as robust and wide-ranging, broad-based fashion as possible. Secondly, through investment in extended and expanded social protection. And this, there are various aspects of this, but generally social protection floors as it goes, deals with basic pensions, income security, health security, unemployment and the like, employment insurance and the like. And then thirdly, the capacities of labor ministries themselves which at the end of the day are the ultimate instrument of society that's responsible for seeing that the basic protections that most countries in the world have signed on to through ILO conventions, or indeed through the labor-related clauses of trade agreements, and there are scores of agreements with such clauses, that those labor ministries and associated agencies have the capacity to actually help implement those labor protections in workplaces around the country, and can identify when there are problems and the like. And then I would add one more dimension to that. If you were to have a true, a truly serious, incredible strategy to make trade more inclusive, I've just referred now to the domestic element of it. But there is a very important role for international cooperation as well. So I would add a fourth element, which is that international cooperation should be restructured and enhanced to provide substantial increased support for all those three dimensions in developing countries. Because in many cases, the developing countries don't have the wherewithal to do that, to do these things well on a broad-based basis. And I would argue that international cooperation, and here referring to both bilateral donor policies as well as multilateral assistance, has not placed a significant priority on funding for this type of capacity, whether at the technical assistance level or the actual programmatic level in countries, to build strong social protection systems, labor ministries, and economic plans that prioritize investment in employment intensive areas of the real economy. I have to say that, discussions, most of the discussions I see on this issue, in my view, from an economic perspective and a social protection, they're nibbling at the margins. Unless we confront the need for there to be this co-equal emphasis on this investment in people agenda, social investment agenda, this domestic institution building agenda, with trade liberalization, then I'm afraid that the model is going to continue to be an unbalanced one. Back to you.
Thanks, Rick. I think also linked to what you were saying about action at the domestic level, we asked the Vice Minister of Guatemala, Minister de Molina, if she could share some examples of progress on trade facilitation being made on the ground in Guatemala. And she had this to say. I think we can run the recording.
Guatemala is making efforts in trade facilitation, simplifying custom procedures, and using information technology for the issuance of the documents related to import, export, and transit of goods. Within these efforts, it deserves special mentioning the measures we implemented with Honduras, which have had a significant impact in trade relationships. First, paperless in custom procedures. Second, pre-arrival processing at integrated border posts, eliminating the double stop at different custom offices when goods cross the border. Third, electronic payment of internal taxes, since Central America has free trade in all originated goods except sugarcane and non-roasting coffee. Fourth, free movement of more than 90% of non-originating goods after they have been imported into the common market. Furthermore, these goods are not subject to physical controls at the border. Fifth, recognition of the same sanitary and phytosanitary status, which complemented the Central American regulation. And sixth, issuance of electronic sanitary and phytosanitary certificates. We are working in implementing these measures with El Salvador, and recently we approved an agreement with Mexico that will make possible custom clearance at an integrated border post. In addition, next Monday, we are releasing a study of customs clearance times at the Central American borders with the action plan to eliminate the bottleneck with the support of the World Customs Organization. And we are also working with the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation in order to optimize all shipping procedures with an electronic platform.
The Vice Minister also mentioned that the reforms that they implemented between Guatemala and Honduras actually led to an annual 10% increase in bilateral trade, and that the higher trade volumes as a result of the reforms led to them increasing customs operating times to 24 hours through the year. So real practical changes on the ground there. We also asked the Vice Minister about the role of the private sector in trade facilitation.
For trade facilitation projects, the private sector can contribute with inputs and comments to the regulations in force or in the approval process. Their feedback is very valuable to improve the rules and procedures or to put in force additional ones. Private sector is also an active member of our National Trade Facilitation Committee and can contribute with the government in implementation of trade facilitation projects.
So Sabine, we heard from the Vice Minister about the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, and we were wondering, what would you as a CEO like to see from a private-public alliance on investment facilitation?
Well, look, I mean, for us, what is obviously important is when we look at like countries, I mean, look at the Southern African tip at this point in time. And what is absolutely vital that if you have border crossing, if you don't have just relationships with one country, but you, for instance, like want to ship from South Africa to Zambia, then you don't want to wait like months and weeks in that time to get goods cleared at the custom border. And so for us, what is really important is that the individual government, and I think the minister just now mentioned it, it is important that the governments involved in the facilitation of the trade between the two countries are enabling these kind of activities and also let private business come in, because what we often see is that government wants to set the rules, but also wants to participate in the value chain. And this, we believe, is problematic because a private business often can run a commercial enterprise, like, for instance, transport, more effective than a state can do. In particular, if you have 2 states involved or 3 states involved, depending on which region and what a trade it is basically impacting, as more complicated and then you have these kind of top up costs on taxes and other aspects which you need to consider, and then you make basically the trade for landlocked countries unattractive. And so therefore, from our point of view, is really would like to see that countries have a collaboration with each other, like, for instance, the North-South corridor between South Africa and Zambia, which is a good example where exactly these bottlenecks have been taken out, and the governments of these countries which are involved in the North-South corridor for transport, for instance, have understood that it's even for their better improvement of their revenue collection, that if private sector comes in and assists in implementing these procedures and also helping to improve the time for shipment, for instance, and custom clearance to the end destination, that it's actually a win-win for both. But I think there is definitely one aspect, and that goes in as well into the digital space, because what we have seen during COVID-19, that many of the supply chains basically collapsed because many companies only had one country they are going to source from, and they had no backup in the supply chain. And I think what we have seen, that is also when other countries and companies come in, they use more digital technologies. Digital technologies require a network. And here again, specifically in the developing world, these are areas where governments want to have influence in setting these digital standards. But I believe here specifically the collaboration between the developed world and the developing world is so important to also share exactly that experience on how you can run an efficient value chain without that the government has to rule into every corner of the activity. maybe one point to Rick's comment, which he made just now, also with regards to the rules and regulation, and in particular around, fair labor practices and the like. We do see countries which obviously have these kind of settings, but I think because of the strong focus on cost only as an input when considering a value chain, I see often that these countries which have such kind of establishment, be it labor organization and the likes, they still not be able to participate in the value chain. And it would be interesting to see how we can change the mindset in beyond just cost saving.
Thank you. Erik, sticking on with government policies, what kind of government policies provide useful signals to private sector-led green trade initiatives, and which ones inadvertently limit or impede them?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to what Rick was saying about thinking holistically about trade. And while he was talking about the labor side, I think it's equally important on the environment side. And I think it goes both ways, right? So Rick was talking about the trade policymakers need to involve labor, but I think the environmental policymakers also need to involve trade. And I'll talk about 3 examples of that. The first is on trade facilitation, and I think that the Vice Minister from Guatemala made a really good point about making sure that the private sector is involved in those trade facilitation committees. And when you see results like we see at the border between Guatemala and Honduras, where the wait time has been reduced from, what was it, 24 hours to 15 minutes. I mean, that's a green trade initiative, and it's good for business, it's good for trade above all, but that is absolutely how we reduce our emissions. That's how, as a logistics company, that is an absolute win. And the private sector can help inform those kinds of policies to make sure that those wait times, those transit times get reduced, because that's the easiest, lowest hanging fruit in terms of decreasing the emissions in supply chains and in logistics. The second area is on trade policy itself, and here I think from a UPS perspective, we see some troubling signs in some of the discussions about environmental trade policy that seems to run over into protectionism. And I think what we have seen is that more liberalized trade has led to a faster and lower cost diffusion of green technologies across all countries. And it would be a shame to lose out on the benefits that has enabled industrialized and emerging markets to achieve because of environmental policies that are, or purported environmental policies that are perhaps just disguised protectionism. So I think that it's, as a guidepost to any kind of environmental policy, environmental trade policy, it should be the diffusion of green technologies is absolutely essential in order for the competitive pressures to lower costs and for those to be diffused more widely. Finally, I want to say something about standards, which has been mentioned, and rules and standards, and on environmental policy. And I'll give a practical example of what UPS confronts. So we have an ambitious agenda to introduce electric vehicles throughout our fleet. And this is a no-brainer for us. That we see the technology coming. We have plans. We know that this fits into our 10, 15, 20-year plans. What we struggle with sometimes is that the standards that have been placed on some of these technologies are far from uniform. In the European Union alone, we face 70 different municipal restrictions on electric vehicles. Some of these are very well intentioned in terms of trying to keep roads safe and trying to keep the city centers clear of vehicles. But the further out our warehousing facilities, our distribution centers are from the city, the harder it is to run electric vehicles. So having a private-public dialogue with municipalities at the national level and also at the international level is really important to make sure that those technologies, that the regulations keep up with the technology so that the private sector can make the investments that we want to make, and that cities and countries want to make as well, but making sure that they fit into the right regulatory structure is really key. And I think, when we see the diffusion and the proliferation of these kinds of standards and regulations across municipalities, something isn't working there. And I think that that's something where at the international level, there can be some political will to make sure that we can all get on the same page and work towards the same goals.
Really important points and quite a few nuances as well about how to balance some of those initiatives. Rick, you also already mentioned a little bit about coordination and how important that is. But I was wondering if you had more specific ideas about the future of WTO and ILO cooperation in particular.
Yes. I'm hoping you can hear me. Yes, I believe. So the future of cooperation between the WTO and other institutions, including ours, I think is potentially a promising one. There's new leadership in the WTO. And notably, from my perspective, we have someone in the leadership of the WTO who is a development professional, a former finance minister, someone who has a more holistic view, to Erik's point, about how you advance socioeconomic progress. So we don't have a trade lawyer per se, or an academic trade economist, as the case may be, as important as those disciplines are. So I see this as an opportunity. We at the ILO were actually quite encouraged when we looked at her first remarks upon assuming the Director General role in the WTO, because as I recall in the first paragraph of that first speech, she said, and I think this could be pretty close to a verbatim quote, that trade is about decent work. I mean, it's about people. That's what she was saying. So I think while there are immediate priorities in respect of the MC12, there's a built-in agenda. There's some very important issues on the table. I do think that there is likely to be an appetite on the part of the WTO for wider engagement and thinking about how one connects better the trade agenda to some of these adjacent agendas that really ultimately determine both whether trade does produce more inclusive and sustainable and resilient outcomes on the one hand, and secondly, whether trade is able to command a strong political consensus, both within countries and across countries. I think that's the unexplored territory, frankly, of the past generation on trade issues, as you will know, Aditi, from our work together. And I'm, modestly hopeful, cautiously optimistic that once hopefully the WTO gets through and past with some reasonable success the immediate MC12 agenda, that there will be a more open conversation and hopefully cooperative institutional agenda going forward along these lines.
That is a hopeful agenda. We have a question in the chat from Emerick, who asks about how to turn the system intrinsically looking for new markets and activities into a system where private sector also tries to reach other goals. I was wondering if Sabine and Erik, you have thoughts about that, if the system itself should be tweaked so that these other goals of labor and environment are more easily reached.
Well, I mean, if I come in, maybe. So from a business point of view, I do think that there are a few areas which maybe enable it in the future, yeah. And I'm hopeful about that, because specifically for multinationals, the focus on ESG aspects in their external reporting will become more important. And I do see, I mean, if I look back now in COVID times, what we have done on the continent, which ordinarily we would potentially have got from other supply chains, but you know, because we couldn't travel and so a lot of restrictions happened, and also bottlenecks in ports and the likes, which everybody is very much aware of. But because these situations happen, and that was clearly dovetailed with a more, say, awakening up in big business to understand that you can't have just one company or two countries supplying you all the commodities. I mean, think about masks and the likes. I mean, this is just, you know, a COVID-related equipment or products. And I see a change there. But for me, what is clearly needed is a principle of how to report these kind of ESG contributions, yeah, and that they're not happening just in the developed world, because it doesn't do the trick for the global society, yeah. But I see that there are more analysts and also more young people asking companies exactly these kind of questions of where you are going to do business, and there I'm hopeful. But it's a long journey. It's not something what has happened very quickly. As I mentioned before, I mean, from a consumer point of view, it's also important, you know, for us to take the right decision when purchasing goods, yeah, and really thinking about where does it come from. We can't think that only the business will look for it, because I mean, at the end of the day, business does need to make profit, and profit you normally also make partially from cost saving. So there is a little bit of dilemma in the whole point of the discussion. But I do believe that if companies and get forced specifically through the consumer of where they are producing the goods. Like, for instance, if goods are produced under unfair labor conditions, would I like to have that? Yeah. So, and having really that request and trying for that transparency, I think that is absolutely of vital importance. The second part is, which I believe will help a bit, is specifically around the topic of climate change and legislation, which is coming in from, for instance, Europe, with regards to the supply chain legislation of, you know, really seeing who has the right conditions to do business and have consequences for it. Yeah, I do hope that business doesn't try to turn it around. You know, there are always companies in which try to find the shortcuts around every legislation. But if I speak, you know, for our company, for Siemens, we always try to obviously maximize our participation in this kind of legislation, try to follow it truly to the point, and not just because we want to have points on a kind of a scorecard, but rather have it as a sustainable embedded policy through all our business transactions.
Thanks. Erik, did you want to come in?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess from my point of view, and you know, I don't know exactly where the questioner is coming from on this, but from our perspective, trade is good. Trade raises incomes. It creates new opportunities. The key to trade is creating a level playing field where everyone has a chance to participate. What Sabine was saying about trade facilitation is so critical. It's not just critical for businesses like Siemens, though. It's critical for small businesses. And we've seen that in COVID, where it is, you know, whether small businesses can get their goods across borders, whether the custom facilities are operating or the ports are operating. This isn't, Walmart has their contracts locked in on container ships years in advance. A small business doesn't. So someone who has a really good idea and is shipping something today is finding their shipping rates have doubled, tripled, quadrupled compared to a year ago. That is a difficult environment, mostly for small businesses. And I think Rick has made some really good points today about, what does it take to create a sustainable trading system where people feel the buy-in, where it's politically sustainable to have an open trade regime, and that depends on being inclusive, being ensuring that trade is helping workers, that it's helping the environment, and that people understand the benefits of trade are not accruing only to a small minority of people or to certain businesses, but that trade can be an opportunity for every business that wants to seek a new market to find those opportunities.
Excellent, thank you. There's another question for you, possibly, I think, to answer in the chat, which is about how can harmonized sustainability standards be efficiently pursued, specifically in the context of the impetus towards decarbonization across supply chains. Maybe you spoke a little bit to that at the start, Erik.
Specifically on cross-border, or forgive me, I didn't read the chat.
The question is, how can harmonized sustainability standards, including common accounting methods for carbon footprinting, be most efficiently pursued, particularly as the impetus for decarbonization across supply chains grows, and if measures such as CBAM comes into effect?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real challenge. I mean, I would be paid a lot more money if I knew the answer to this question. I think everyone is trying to figure this out. And the CBAM is, something that clearly has a lot of merits, and I think has, been suggested in a way that understands that carbon emissions in one place, are just as important as carbon emissions in another. And we're just squeezing a balloon if we don't take that into account. But I think the important, from our perspective, is we don't want to have those standards be so onerous that it impedes cross-border trade. So, we would, I think, an international carbon accounting standard that took into account differences between countries is really essential. I don't think we have that yet. I think that's something that is probably in the next stage that international organizations really need to get a handle on, and that's what we'd like to see. That and something that is trade facilitating rather than trade limiting.
Great.
If you'd like, I could take a shot at that one as well.
Yes, please.
So I do think that the questioner is on to something here. There are not a few countries that would probably be prepared to better align a number of, aspects of the regulatory environment as it affects how inclusive and how environmentally sustainable trade is. And as we know, a lot of FTAs basically spend much of their time looking at aligning, regulations and institutions and their practices. And there's no reason why that shouldn't extend to labor-related issues and environmentally related issues. In fact, I have long believed and have written about the sensible thing on the climate side is to add an additional trade policy dimension to the climate strategy. Namely by creating groups of countries, hopefully including both developed and developing countries, that will be prepared to align some of their standards, their subsidy practices, and even potentially their carbon pricing regimes through some mutual recognition approach. There's a whole slew of areas in how they deal with investment and disclosure, how they deal with tariffs on environmentally friendly goods and services on the one hand, how they deal with fossil fuel subsidies. There are many dimensions of what we have called previously, sustainable energy trade agreement, or what I call low carbon trade agreement. It's just not the traditional approach, which is looking at lowering market barriers for commercial access or investment access. This is looking at deliberately using trade as a mechanism to better align, create a larger zone for the diffusion of low carbon technologies, goods, and services, if you will, using both carrots and sticks. And I happen to think this is probably the only way we're going to make any rapid progress on the carbon border adjustment question, because I have my own doubts about the compatibility of some of the unilateral proposals that have been made, in passing muster under WTO jurisprudence. But I think if a group of countries agree to mutually recognize on some of these dimensions and also align some of their technical standards and some of the other dimensions I've talked about, including the way that they require for there to be disclosure and accounting on these matters, that could make a significant contribution. And to Sean Doherty's point in the chat, I think a similar approach could be taken by groups, ever expanding groups of like-minded countries on aspects of labor and social inclusion along the lines that I just suggested, particularly if it was coupled with an increase in international cooperation, development assistance for this purpose with developing countries, not unlike the approach taken in the trade facilitation agreement. Let me end this comment by suggesting that we would all do well to think about an environmental trade facilitation agreement approach might be a good way to go in this regard, in the way I'm talking about here, or a trade and decent work facilitation agreement approach. I think this is probably the way forward to get a multilateral discipline through the WTO process is really unrealistic politically. But I think this approach, looking at more of the facilitative and mutual recognition and standards alignment side of things, would be much more promising and have much more impact in the near to medium term.
Sabine, did you want to come in on any of that?
Well, I mean, look, clearly it goes a little bit into the topic that obviously climate action specifically within the supply chain are absolutely complex and needed, yeah. But if you think about like international companies, you take maybe automobile industry, yeah, to really decarbonize their value chain is not as simple, yeah. And it comes back to what I also mentioned earlier, is in order to make sure that you have these kind of data, you need to digitalize the supply chain. And that is unfortunately currently the way and how the standards are, but specifically in the developing country, a huge disadvantage for developing country to participate to that extent, because you can't break it down that much at the current point in time. But there is technology available. And that's why coming also to the point I made earlier on the COVID side, what we have seen as bad COVID is with all the impact it created. But on one side, it did create, first of all, a wake-up call, I think, to many companies that you need to diversify your supply chain across the globe so that you are not depending on one when it's falling away, so that you really have a diversity. And here, I think there is a possibility for developing countries also to position themselves partially also on the topic of climate-related aspects, because many of the developing countries are not big climate emission countries. Yeah, so if you look at the globe and you look at Africa, there is hardly any emission coming from the African economy. So I think there is a possibility also to take that as an asset because they are on the verge to develop into new energy sources. And why not going into a kind of a renewable energy source when you develop the market in any case? So I do believe there is a possibility of a win-win, but it needs to have the willingness of companies, but also the development world, to invest in these kind of countries for the benefit of the global economy. And secondly, what we do see is that during the last 20 months, digital technologies have really leapfrogged in the developed world, and particularly here on the African continent, which if you would have asked me before, would that be possible to do many things digital? No, I would have said a year ago or 2 years ago, if you would have spoken at the same time, I would have said it will take another 5 years. And we really see that things could move along, and not everything is as complicated anymore that it has to be. But is it yet perfect? No, it's also not. So I do believe there is some space. I see there's also in the chat a question with regards to the carbon certificate and the carbon trading. Well, I mean, we tried this a few years backwards, but that was obviously before there was a bigger awareness of climate change, and we found that very challenging to find really to use these kind of carbon credits in order to fund projects. Yeah, so often we saw that companies would like, you know, to shift reduce carbon emissions in their home country and shift the production to a country where nobody really looks at it that carefully. And so through, you know, having a bigger GDP assigned to their home country production, obviously they would have a benefit from it. And I do believe maybe after COP26 there is a bigger awareness for it, but it needs a lot of work still.
Thank you. We were talking about private ambitions in response to climate and the environment and labor. Erik, I know that in the area of trade and gender, UPS has been very active as well and managed to form partnerships and do a lot of practical work on the ground. I was wondering if you wanted to mention anything on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's relevant to this discussion because I think that it can scale to different areas that we've been talking about, including, you know, more non-gender inclusive labor market improvements, but also in the terms of green trade. But you know, for the last several years, UPS has had a women's exporter program that works to build capacity within for women entrepreneurs, women business owners, small and medium-sized enterprises, that, you know, where we've been able to identify many of the constraints that women have faced to trade. A lot of these are in trade facilitation, as we've discussed so much today. Areas like national trade facilitation committees, where there's less inclusion. Being able to reach out to women, understand their needs, and then bring that back to policymakers when we talk to our partners, for example, at the ITC or at the WTO, has been really key, where we can talk to them and say, look, you know, one of the best things you can do as a country to improve women's participation in your economy is and in trade is to make sure that women are involved in the National Trade Facilitation Committee. In country after country, we see limits on women in trade that are low-hanging fruit. It's simple things like including having women's bathrooms at border posts, lighting that allows cross-border traders to safely come back after they traded their goods from one side of the border to another. These things are not necessarily that difficult, but they don't get raised in a room that isn't inclusive. And so that's one of the things that we love working with our customers, and women are a big part of our customer base, and we're happy to help them. But I think the key to this program is taking those learnings and bringing it back to the policy side, where we can use our influence as a large company to help governments understand where these constraints are.
Really great examples there, and it's interesting that sometimes the frictions that we think about aren't always as big as we think they are. It's about making sure that the right people in the room are there to raise them. Sabine, you've mentioned in the past the way Siemens works, especially in Africa, with various governments. And I was wondering if there were some examples of local value creation of companies that you've seen that you think could be replicated or scaled up?
Well, look, there are a couple of areas, and I mean, so coming back to particular what Erik mentioned on women development, yeah, I mean, we have incorporated that into our supply chain. I mean, in the engineering space, that's normally anyway not a market which is dominated by women. So finding companies which are women-owned or where women engineers are behind to feed into the supply chain is really, really difficult. So we partner up with various organizations, like for instance, African Lionesses, which is an organization which identified women within the supply chain, women entrepreneurs, but also women in energy for Africa is one part where we work with. So we really try also to support these kind of organizations, which then do, because what we need is for all our executions in country, because if you look on the African continent, and I'm sure it's valid for many other regions as well, it's a vast continent, the distances are huge, and you can't do everything by yourself, and you always need to, specifically in project execution, you need to, you know, have local companies coming in from the community, but also because they have certain certificates and the likes. And so our part is really around enterprise and supplier development, what means we will see that we tap companies, small, medium enterprises into our supply chain during execution of projects, and then have them potentially in many areas, if projects are in a remote environment, come in as partner, and they support us then on the service side, so that they also have, you know, business going on. Because the biggest challenge, Erik mentioned that as well, is sustainability. Because where's the point to develop a company if then when you finish with a project, they don't have any business to go buy this going forward, because then, you know, the investment would not be good. And what we always try is to help them as well with a business plan, but also with two very, very important parts, and that goes a bit back to what Rick mentioned, is about fair labor practice. But fair labor practice also starts with aspects like health and safety, yeah, quality management. Because if you don't have health and safety procedures, when you have people working for you as a small, medium enterprise on the African continent, you are not going to work with multinationals, yeah, because we all need to make sure that we have certain standards, like ISO standards or anything they like applied when we execute. And it doesn't matter if we do it ourselves or if a subcontractor is doing it. If we the overall contractor, we still have the responsibility. And these are the areas where you can help small and medium enterprises significantly, and obviously increasing the awareness of fair treatment within the country. Hope that answers your question.
Perfect. And just a last question before we start wrapping up, to Rick, in the theme of inclusive trade, we heard a little bit about gender and SMEs, and I was wondering if you could say a word or two about this new focus on marginalized communities and really looking at the trade distributional effects that affect them.
I don't have that much to say on it, because I'm not sure which new approach you're referring to and by whom.
So, for instance, with the US's USTR has asked for more information and studies to understand the distributional effects of trade on marginalized and ethnic minority communities in the US. And I think others are starting to understand that this is something we have very little data on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's terrific that we're trying to get more evidence on this, more granular or more reliable evidence in this regard. So I think it's a terrific undertaking there. And this is part of what I mean by, by having a co-equal parallel focus on the domestic side of the ledger in terms of policy and institutional strength. And I think that's a very important facet of it. So I think that the leadership of the WTO is quite interested as well. Dr. Ngozi has a well-known interest in gender gender and trade matters, and we institutionally are actually doing some work together. Our research teams are beginning to look together at this a bit more. So I do think that this is a productive avenue of inquiry.
Thank you. Well, it's been a fantastic discussion, and I'm trying to summarize what we've talked about. It's been wide-ranging, of course. And then I'd like to really hand it over to you for last thoughts on your side before we close. But from my perspective, we talked a little bit about trade rules and that the fact that they really derive meaning through implementation, and they're not just meant to be created to stay on paper. They're a means to an end, and there's a need now, I think, to really look at how to move the system from just liberalizing and market access for profit motives to the kinds of global challenges that we recognize trade has to play a role in, and that businesses have developed ambitions to help solve. And also, we need to be looking at liberalizing the right kind of trade and diffusing green technologies, for instance, and stay away from disguised protectionism where we can. Third, where there is private ambition to help with gender, labor, environment, we can look at some of the specific frictions that prevent those from coming into place, and understanding where governments have to step in more and where they step further back. And then also recognizing that some of the frictions maybe aren't as big as we might think. There may be existing institutions that could deal with them as long as the specific issues are raised. We could also be learning more from the crisis. As Sabine mentioned, there's a lot on facilitation and the importance of diversification that needs to, and digitalization that needs to be incorporated into other challenges going forward. And then finally, for the bigger issues, we really should be looking more at what's worked well, for instance, in trade facilitation, looking at some of those models where developed countries do aid in the reform for developing countries. And so there isn't a zero-sum game there. And then finally, looking to see where progress can be made through clubs of willing countries that can act together on various aspects, and ensure that just because there isn't as much going on in multilateral negotiations, that we're not handicapped by that. But I'll end there, and I'd really love to hear from each of you, just a minute or two to wrap up before we go, and start with you, Sabine.
Well, I mean, it was very interesting, and thanks also for giving us and me the opportunity to participate. I thought it was good to get some inputs from Rick as well as from Erik from different industry and different thought points. Yeah, as you already summarized, I think it's important that we use digital technologies and use a time of uncertainty to make something better, because I do believe we also, owe that to the developing world, and therefore I count on everybody to look how to improve the trade situation, particular between the developed and developing countries, because as Erik mentioned already, trade does create jobs, and we do need to increase the value chain contribution of the developing countries. There is some hope, specifically in African continent, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which hopefully will address some of these barriers as a general for the continent. Is a long way, but we do see positive sign, and I think the crisis now also has put forward that Africa particular has to pull together in order to participate globally. And lastly, I do believe consumers take at the end of the day the final choice through their consumption patterns and from where they are going to buy, and I think that's something what needs to be motivated. Thank you.
Perfect. Erik?
I think, to conclude, this is a really exciting time for the trade, the inclusive and sustainable trade agenda. I think the ideas that we've discussed today are really exciting. I think some of this is the shocks that we've had to the global trading system, whether it's the political questioning of the WTO, for example, whether it's shocks like what we've seen in my country, in the US, with George Floyd, and the discussion that started about inclusion and making sure that the economy works for everybody, or whether it's COVID. It's very clear that we need to think differently about the paradigms that we have around us. And I think the discussions that we've seen at COP, the discussions that hopefully will go forward at the WTO in March, knock on wood, I think they're exciting. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity for governments, for the private sector, for civil society to work together to find solutions. I think my only note of caution is to not lose sight of what we've built. And I think that the international trade architecture, which is part of the overall international system, is an intergovernmental system, is supremely important. It's the only way that we can have these discussions in a coherent way. We might disagree on some things, but it's under negotiation. It's through thoughtful discussion that those kinds of issues should be resolved, and not something where we throw away the whole system.
A good reminder. Rick, last word to you.
Okay, well, many thanks to you, Aditi, and the forum, and also salutations to IISD for being resilient and carrying on despite the postponement of the intergovernmental part of this ministerial. So you're leading by doing in this regard, showing what resilience can be in this more digital age. The last maybe thought I would have in this regard is, you've highlighted in your session description that business leadership group came together across 12 sectors in all regions to release this call to action for governments to upgrade trade outcomes to be more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive. So, I think this is welcome. I do believe this is a moment when hopefully people's assumptions are being re-examined, and policymakers and institutional assumptions are being re-examined. And we can rewire the international cooperative and rule-making architecture in some of the ways that we've discussed here today. And the business community, if it chose to and had the right facilitation and leadership, could be a very important force for kind of shaking the system and the institutions in it out of their established assumptions. So I'm encouraged by that, and look forward to perhaps that group of businesses examining some of the specific options here, some of the specific agendas that we put on the table more closely, and advocating for them, because I think what is needed is a strategic reorientation of trade policy and trade-related institutions, and linked to development cooperation, and linked much better to domestic agendas in the labor environment and other areas for that matter. So with that, let me compliment you and IISD for organizing this discussion, because it does give us an opportunity to think a little outside the MC12 box. And with that, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. I think we started this whole session talking a little bit about the challenges, asking the audience to think about some of the frictions that prevent us from making trade work better. And we really ended with a lot of solutions and a lot of examples of where things are working well. So thank you for keeping it all very positive and moving forward. And thanks so much to the audience for your participation and for staying with us. And with that, we'll end.